President Trump moments ago doubling down on his social media post, saying that he has directed 2 American nuclear submarines toward Russian water.
We had to do that. We just have to be careful. And a threat was made, and we didn't think it was appropriate, so I have to be very careful. So I do that on the basis of safety for our people. A threat was made by a former president of Russia, and we're going to protect our people.
All right, the threat that he is referring to does come from the former Russian president, also now currently very senior in the Russian Defense Department, Dmitry Medvedev. He is now the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council. And Medvedev said, and I quote, "Let Trump remember his favorite films about the walking dead, as well as how dangerous a dead hand that does not exist in nature can be." Now, the dead hand is a reference to Russia's dead hand system. Basically, even if you knock everybody out with a nuclear strike, the Kremlin is destroyed, the system will automatically fire back. That's the dead hand pushing the button. And it comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin tonight said this.
Russia isn't capturing territory. We are returning what's rightfully ours.
I want to go straight to Natasha Bertrand. She's at the Pentagon, and our Nick Payton-Walsh, who is right now on the ground in Kyiv, both with us on this breaking news on this Friday. And Natasha, Trump doubling down on this, right? Sending nuclear submarines towards Russia. Obviously, when you think about the context here, what Putin's saying, this couldn't come at a more fraught time.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very thinly veiled threat, not only by Medvedev, but also by President Trump. And it's maybe an empty one because we don't actually know where these submarines are. That is by design. We may never know because their location at any given time is one of the most closely held secrets by the U.S. military officials. That is why the location of these submarines is very rarely publicly discussed. But, you know, we also don't know what kind of submarines President Trump is talking about. All of the Navy's submarines are nuclear power, but only about 14 of them can actually carry nuclear warheads. So that is unclear as well. But they are regularly carrying out these kinds of patrols in international waters, and they can hit targets thousands of miles away. So if President Trump really wanted to order some kind of strike on the Russians, then he could have done that without telegraphing this publicly, of course, without even having to move them any closer to Russia than they perhaps already are as part of their routine patrols. But at the very least, this is a very clear message to the Russians at a very sensitive moment between Washington and Moscow because of the tensions over these peace talks with the Ukrainians that are simply not materializing because President Putin continues, of course, to ignore President Trump's entreaties to come to the table here, Aaron.
And Nick, you know, as you know, and you're on the ground in Kyiv tonight, Medvedev thrives on provocation, right? Dire nuclear threats, right? Which are not nothing, but most world leaders dismiss them as real threats. But Trump tonight doing something different, right? Wanting to publicly acknowledge it, even though he has ignored some of Medvedev's past threats of nuclear Armageddon. So, you know, when you take that, plus what we're hearing from Putin today, right? What he said, Putin today, he talked about, Nick, it was, quote, taking back what's rightfully ours. Certainly seeming to imply why do a ceasefire if he could go ahead and continue to win militarily in Ukraine. So how is this playing out on the front line?
Yeah, I mean, it's utterly bizarre that Medvedev, someone who's been kind of tuned out, frankly, for the last 3.5 years, whenever he makes particularly wide-ranging apocalyptic threats as just somebody who doesn't have agency within the Kremlin, is the one who sparks this unprecedented, frankly, public discussion of American nuclear assets by a US president, something, frankly, that never happens and you wouldn't really expect to hear from the White House. Clearly, Trump feeling he has to escalate back, not wanting the Kremlin to feel they can idly threaten the United States. So that leads us into a very complex week ahead, because on August the 8th, just under 7 days from now, Trump has to decide to implement the sanctions against Russian and allies, energy consumers that he's threatened, if, as it seems, Putin doesn't come to a sudden peace agreement, and Putin himself returning to his maximalist demands, saying that they're taking back what's rightfully theirs is the Russian narrative that Ukraine doesn't really exist as a country that led to the invasion in February 2022. He's going back to those wider ideas, not shifting in the slightest. And earlier today saying Trump's disappointment in him is down to unrealistic expectations. Look, Putin was clear they're having success on the front lines. There's something we've seen over the last week's reporting along the eastern front line. He's confident that will indeed continue. And so there's no sign at all, frankly, from the words we're hearing in Moscow that any kind of successful peace is imminent. And so that makes this odd, weird nuclear bluster we've just heard, coupled with a week ahead of that deadline next weekend, so incredibly fraught and important. But some Ukrainians, frankly, will hear this and think, this is the United States potentially suggesting military involvement here or talk back to Moscow, and that will lift hearts here. Aaron?
Yeah, sometimes the rhetoric of the U.S. using the word nuclear, that rhetoric alone, as you point out, unprecedented, and that may be what matters most. Thank you both so much.
The President of the United States today rattled the nuclear saber against Russia, writing on social media, quote, "I've ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just that." The president was referring to comments from former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev, referring to Russia's so-called dead hand system, which could automatically retaliate if an enemy were to launch a strike on Russia.
He was talking about nuclear. When you talk about nuclear, we have to be prepared, and we're totally prepared.
Joining us now is former NATO Supreme Allied Commander General Wesley Clark and CNN political and national security analyst David Sanger. Good to have you both here tonight. General Clark, is this an appropriate response, assuming that the president did what he said he did, and that is move nuclear submarines in response to a remark on social media?
Actually, it probably feeds the Russian disinformation plan because it raises the temperature, scares people that there might be a nuclear, and that's what Russia's been trying to do all along, is scare people about nuclear. Now, if you want an effective response, you push the weapons into Ukraine. And instead, they've been slowed to a trickle. Yeah. So, you know, this is just rhetoric, but it's rhetoric that he may think it makes him look strong and tough in front of some supporters, but actually it works against us and in favor of Russia.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting if he does this, but doesn't, for instance, impose the sanctions he's promised to do in a week or so's time. David, if one follows Dmitry Medvedev on social media, as I do, you can see, and I'm sure you know as well, that this is not an isolated comment. He tends to make quite incendiary claims on social media. Do folks in the national security space here in the U.S. take those comments seriously?
They don't, Jim. I mean, you'll remember that Medvedev was the guy who stood in as president of Russia when Putin was term limited and spent a few years out of power and then came back in after Medvedev was there. I met him once or twice during that time, and he at that moment was sounding relatively reasonable, telling jokes, did not seem out of the mainstream, also didn't seem to have very much power. These days, he's turned into, and really since the invasion of Ukraine, into an incredibly hot-headed internet troll who sits on the National Security Committee but does not really have any power. And what's interesting to me here is the president decided to rise to the bait because, you know, you and I have both written about nuclear saber rattling that's taken place since the Ukraine war started, but it was all in the other direction, right? It was Putin threatening to use nuclear weapons either publicly or moving them around as he did in October of 2022. We haven't seen it from the U.S., and that's what made this different.
Yeah, you and I wrote about that time in the fall of 2022 when the U.S. was quite concerned that Russia might use a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. So, General Clark, to you, I suppose the concern in cycles of escalation, right, is that it's what's happening and it's what the other side.
We have some breaking news from the president, who just announced he is repositioning nuclear submarines around Russia in response to what he called inflammatory statements from the former Russian president. Trump just posted, quote, based on the highly provocative statements of the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who is now the deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation, I have ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in the appropriate regions just in case these foolish and inflammatory statements are more than just words. Words are very important and can often lead to unintended consequences. I hope this will not be one of those instances. He's apparently referring to Medvedev's statements recently criticizing Trump's foreign policy and appearing to reference a nuclear strike. I want to bring in retired Army Colonel Jack Jacobs, MSNBC military analyst. Jack, what signal is Trump trying to send here? What do you make of this back and forth?
Well, we have to remember what probably generated all this from Medvedev in the first place. I mean, first of all, as an aside, the tendency to shoot from the hip, and has done so many times in the past. And this may be one of those times. But what the problem that Russia has at the moment is the crippling results of strictures on their economy as a result of the war in Ukraine and the restrictions the United States and its allies have put on the Russian economy. This makes it extremely difficult for the oligarchs who surround Putin, and that includes Medvedev as well. And so it's not surprising that harsh words are coming from the Kremlin. They don't disavow them, but frequently these words are left to dissipate in the ether and nothing ever comes of them. Trump's response
to that point, Jack, here's my question, because you make such a good point, and the New York Times puts it this way. While Mr. Trump commands the world's most powerful military, Mr. Medvedev is widely seen as a social media attack dog relegated to the periphery of President Putin's inner circle. So why even respond?
Part of it has to do with how Trump responds to anything.
The approaches by Trump are provoking the world. Look, I'm not going to defend Russia. I can think of no 2 men I trust least to keep a cool, calm composure than Vlad and Donnie, right? And so I'm not a fan of either of these guys. Kind of wish they'd both go away permanently, right? We wouldn't have to deal with them again. But the reality is, if words alone were enough to provoke the movement of nuclear arms to prepare them better for attack, which, guys, make no mistake, if Trump said something stupid, which he is wont to do, and another country moved weapons closer to the United States in direct response, they would see that as an attack, and they would say preemptively we're responding. I mean, the U.S. for no good reason bombed Iran. You know, it's not like Iran moved weapons. You know, they had an ally that was somehow nearby, and they moved weapons. Say Russia let them, and Iran moved weapons near Alaska or what have you, right? But this is Donald Trump's world, and he's done it with the tariffs too. And I know people are like, well, tariffs and literal military stuff, they're not the same, and they're not. But, you know, Trump has talked about tariffs in a militaristic type sense. Our country is losing. We need to launch effectively economic warfare and win, right? Which goes against the general philosophy that governs trade, which is that, look, you don't want to romanticize free trade because it's often been used to exploit workers and degrade labor standards and environmental standards. But the idea behind it is through trades, both sides can win, hypothetically. It's not warfare. In fact, you could argue that increased trade discourages warfare because if you're trading with a country, bombing them is going to make you both poorer, right? But his tariff plan has also been connected to annexation. He's saying it's openly an act of economic domination and conquest against Canada. And so whether it's moving around nukes or it's his tariffs, Trump is assaulting the world.